Brown bread was a staple food here in Plymouth for centuries. Although its form and formula did evolve over all those generations, it had an amazingly long run as a distinctive regional bread. Based on corn and rye meals, it was deeply flavored, solid, filling, and kind of addictive. Eaten by rich and poor alike, brown bread was beloved by locals, but perhaps a bit alarming to outsiders. The version I make in this video represents my notion of brown bread as it may have been made from around 1750 to 1825. The essence of brown bread is flint corn, for centuries the agricultural backbone of Plymouth, and before that of Wampanoag, Patuxet. The grain must first be ground into meal. Plymouth had pounding, or grist mills from the 1630s on, along Town Brook. The remaining ingredients are rye, optionally wheat, a natural leavening culture, salt, and by the 18th century, a smidge of molasses. Yesterday, I mixed the rye meal with a leavening culture to get it working. See the cracks formed in the flour that was sprinkled on the surface as the dough ferments? Using a common practice of the time, I scalded the cornmeal with boiling water and added the salt and molasses. Once all that has cooled down a bit, we're ready to mix it all together. It smells really interesting at this point, as the cidery tang of the rye ferment collides with the savory cornmeal molasses aroma. As I mentioned, molasses became part of the bread's composition probably during the 18th century when Plymouth was deeply engaged in the sugar-based Atlantic economy, making molasses and rum ubiquitous to the region. But the finished bread does not taste at all sweet, rather deep and complex and caramelized. In its heyday, this bread was often made with no wheat at all in it, just the corn and rye that could be grown well locally, and I've been experimenting with reducing the proportion of wheat when I make it. But today I'm ending up using more than I intended because I've already committed too much liquid into the mix to be able to leave it out. It's a pretty wet, loose dough, and when you're making a lot, as I do when the Harlow breakfast is not a virtual affair, it feels a lot more like mixing mortar than any other bread I'm familiar with. I'll let it ferment a while in bulk in a bowl, and then I'll shift it to a cloth-lined basket to rise, which it won't do very much, while I heat up the oven. This outdoor masonry oven, which we built about 5 years ago, functions exactly like the ovens in the Harlow Old Fort House, which is to say, like those built into most every house in New England over the course of many decades. Ovens and bakers, of course, vary, but the dominant principles remain those dictated by the laws of thermodynamics, whichever century you live in. To get ready to bake, you burn a brisk fire over the course of a few hours to thoroughly heat the masonry. Then you clear out the coals and sweep out the ashes, and the residual heat is what bakes your bread, cakes, pies, beans, etc. It felt weird to bake only one lonely loaf of this bread. Typically for the Harlow breakfast, I load that oven full north, south, east, and west. The heavy loaves grow together as they bake, and it's a wrestling match to get them out when the time comes. They bake very differently from most any other sort of bread, given the unique formulation. Essentially, the longer you can leave them in the oven, the better in terms of flavor. Ideally, 3 or 4 hours later, the temperature will have dropped by hundreds of degrees, and the loaves will be deeply browned and smelling irresistible. It's during that long period in the falling heat that the magic happens. Now that you've seen how much goes into this simple bread,
you probably aren't eager to make it at home, but a good case can be made for making its descendant. In the very end of the 19th century, the most common way to make brown bread, now that people didn't have wood-fired ovens in their houses much anymore, they did have cast iron wood-fired cook stoves, which were great for boiling things. So brown bread made a transition from being a yeasted or sour leavened bread like this to being this very similar rye, corn, and wheat, molasses, salt, and some baking soda, a modern ingredient for the 19th century, steamed in a can, or first it was steamed in a lard pail or any other metal pail that was round, or in crockery too. I would advocate using the recipe that I will give you to make the brown bread of more recent New England and of my own childhood. It's just as delicious in its own different way, but it's the descendant, the grandchild, the great-grandchild of this bread.